Welcome everyone to this online edition of the University of Toronto Where You Are series of events for alumni, which brings some of the University of Toronto's most compelling thought leadership to you, wherever you are in the Greater Toronto Area, across Canada, or around the world. Before I begin, I wish to acknowledge the land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it's been the traditional home of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently, the Mississaugas of the Credit River. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous peoples from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have this opportunity to work and learn on this land. Today, I'm delighted to welcome Professor Miriam Diamond as she discusses what we can do to combat climate change. The U of T Where You Are lectures share some of the cutting-edge thinking that is emerging from the university's top researchers, innovators, and teachers. We're fortunate to be able to attract and retain leading faculty members, in part thanks to our global excellence and reputation and our location within one of the world's most diverse and dynamic city regions. Indeed, it's our location within the Greater Toronto Area and in Canada that draws many students and researchers to our university. Similarly, it's the beauty of our three campuses that they appreciate once they're here, be it the Mississauga, Scarborough, or downtown Toronto campuses. As you might know, the St. George campus is currently undergoing one of the boldest and biggest open-air projects in more than a century. Supported by close to 3,000 donors to date, the Landmark project recently broke ground earlier this spring and is revitalizing the heart of our campus, creating more gardens, walking paths, and pavilions. The project will result in the removal of all above-ground parking from the front campus and make the grounds more beautiful and accessible, and will contribute to making the St. George campus more sustainable. The project includes an ambitious plan to install Canada's largest urban geothermal field beneath King's College Circle. This will provide the sustainable energy to the surrounding buildings and will serve as a unique educational opportunity for students both from the University of Toronto, from high schools, and from other institutions. It's also expected to save 15,000 tons of greenhouse gas emissions a year. That's equivalent to taking 3,000 cars off the road. Landmark is just one of the university's long-term plans to make us more energy efficient and to help mitigate our climate footprint. And to speak to us about our changing climate, it now gives me great pleasure to introduce our guest speaker. Miriam Diamond is a professor in the Department of Earth Sciences, and this follows a long affiliation with the Department of Geography and Planning since 1991. She is cross-appointed to the Department of Chemical Engineering and Applied Chemistry and the Dalla Lana School of Public Health, the School of the Environment, and the Department of Physical and Environmental Sciences at the University of Toronto, Scarborough. The goal of Professor Diamond's multidisciplinary research program is to improve our understanding of chemical contaminants from emission through to transport indoors and outdoors, and ultimately human and ecological exposure. Her research has been published in more than 100 articles and chapters and has received widespread media attention.
Barbara, thank you very much for that kind introduction. I'm so pleased and honored that you've invited me to speak. I'm going to be speaking about why should you care and what can you do about climate change. My goals in this talk are to explain why we should care. Very simply, because it's for our kids and our grandkids' future. And here I am with my daughter, Sarah, and my son, Aaron. And this is really dedicated to them and hopefully their children. I'm going to explain why climate change is an existential threat. We're going to talk about how we can act to limit climate change and its many consequences. It's all about energy, and it's all about us making change. Why is climate change an existential threat? It's very clear, because our society's prosperity, stability, and health depend on a very stable climate. And I put past there because we're out of the zone of a very stable climate. The IPCC, the International Panel on Climate Change, has very clearly and definitively shown that a 1.5 degree C global warming, and we're on our way now actually to a 2 degree C warming, will have the following consequences. We're going to see increases in dangerously hot days, defined as a heat wave of 4 or more days. It's going to increase by 28% for 1.5 degrees C warming, almost 50% for 2 degrees C global warming. We're going to see greater likelihood of super powerful storms, and we've had some this season. We're going to see increased heavy rainfalls with the consequence of flooding, as you can see in the picture above from a 2018 storm event in Toronto. We're going to see an increase in a 1 in 50-year flood that will start to occur, or it is occurring, 1 every 42 years for 1.5 degrees C warming, and 1 in 34 years for a 2 degrees C warming. We're going to see greater incidence of forest fires. I opened this talk with a photo of the forest fire that's just happened in California over the past few months. We're going to see sea level rise. Well, perhaps that won't affect us in some locations, but what it does, it affects coastal flooding, and the probability of flooding, and so much of the world's population lives in coastal zones. So I said that we should care because it affects our society's prosperity, health and well-being, and stability. Extreme weather costs money. It costs a lot of money. For example, you can go to this NOAA website, which recounts just for the US that between 1980 and 2020, there were 18 large billion-dollar cost wildfires, 28 droughts, 48 tropical cyclones, 126 severe storms, 33 flooding events, 17 winter storms, and so on. So this is just a recounting. They have not figured out yet what the cost is of the California wildfires. It's going to come in at billions of dollars, and they incurred 41 deaths. Well, this isn't all about the US. We don't have a tally like this, but we know that the Fort McMurray fire that happened a few years ago, those wildfires cost now, the tally is almost $9 billion. So you're probably asking, well, like, can we attribute the extreme climate and these extreme events to climate change? What's the connection? You know, it's like if you have a sore throat, or if you're sick, you go, you know, my symptoms are consistent with me having this adverse effect. You can never have, you can seldom have a one-to-one connection of causation. But what you can have is a probability of causation. So let's look at this slide down here. Here we have, let's look at this curve, the curve to the left. And it goes from cold to hot. So under average conditions, which we've left in the 1980s, you have this average, and you have a certain number of very cold events and a certain number of very hot events. What climate change does is, by having that global warming, and by the way, Canada's global warming is increasing at twice the rate. Sorry, Canada's warming is increasing at twice the rate of the global rate of warming. So it pushes us farther towards the hot. And what that means is that we have more very hot weather, we have more extreme weather events, we have less cold weather. And by the way, I should point out, more extreme weather, that costs us in deaths, and specifically for the elderly and for the young. More hot weather means more air conditioning, and that means more air pollution. Well, you might be happy about less extreme cold, but you know what? The extreme cold kills parasites and all sorts of deadly diseases. Okay, but anyways, back to this question. Is climate change causing these extreme weather events? There was a very clear reason why scientists were not making the connection between extreme weather events and climate change. And that's because of the very effective lobbying of the fossil fuel industry, putting a chill on that science. But those lobbying and the extremely aggressive intimidation against scientists has abated from the fossil fuel industry. And there's been a rise in attribution science. Attribution science looks at the probability of an event being connected to climate, in this case, climate change. So attribution science, these researchers looked at 170 studies, and they investigated the role of human-induced climate change in 190 extreme weather events. They found that in terms of heat waves, there was a significant increase in the probability or the likelihood that climate change was causing them. So you can see here, this is more extreme events are likely to occur, especially with heat, with drought, rain and flooding, less so with oceans, less so with cold and ice and other storms. I want to point out here, drought means less water, but it also means more precarious agricultural produce. So you often hear the term, well, you know, we've had extreme climate in the past, so like this isn't new, we will adapt. Okay, here's what's missing in that naysayer's comment. Modern civilization is poised on really a razor-thin edge of stable climate. If you think of all our infrastructure, all our whole society is poised on a very stable, predictable climate. Yes, we've had variations in climate. So here we're going from 100,000 years before present, taking us up to the current. This is looking back into geological time. Here we have a proxy for temperature fluctuations. So yeah, there were a lot of temperature fluctuations. And here along the bottom of the graph, we see that there's the first migration of fully modern humans out of Africa. Aborigines live in Australia. But it's not until we get into the Holocene, which is about 10,000 years ago, that we see a stabilized climate and the growth of modern contemporary civilization. Most importantly, with the advent of agriculture, which allowed us to put aside surpluses and to develop the complexities that we see in our society today. So here's what keeps me up at night. What I've just said is that our society is finely tuned to a stable, predictable climate. But our prosperity has been intimately connected to the burning of fossil fuels. This graph that extends from 1890 to 1980 plots along here the fuel energy use, which has risen in an exponential way, very dramatically, and gross national product expressed in billions of dollars in 1972 dollars. You can see that tight coupling between the growth of GNP and fuel use, which in this case is fossil fuel use. So it's very clear that the current prosperous conditions that we enjoy are because of fossil fuels. But it's those very fossil fuels that many of us, including myself, believe could be our downfall. And that's because these fossil fuels are now pushing us away from a stable climate. So here we have a graph that shows, again, year from 1880 to the year 2020. We have the difference from 20th century average temperature. So these are cooler years, and then these are warmer years. And then on the right-hand graph, on the right-hand side of the graph, we have the axis which shows temperature. So the red are the anomalies, or sorry, the right shows carbon dioxide. And then the line shows the temperature increase. So we can see since 1980, we've been experiencing consistently warmer weather, and it's tied to carbon dioxide, which is a greenhouse gas. Fossil fuels have very simply caused contemporary climate change at a very swift rate. We are emitting carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases because primarily our fossil fuel combustion, which has powered our economy. But we are heating up because of it. We need to decouple wealth from energy, specifically from fossil fuel energy. The good news is that we appear to have reached peak oil, and we have been successful somewhat at decoupling energy, specifically fossil fuel use and GDP. So this is a graph that shows energy use along here in kilograms of oil equivalents per $1,000 of GDP. And it extends from 1990 to the year 2014. And we can see at a global scale that we've been decreasing our oil equivalency use per $1,000 of GDP. That is really good news. In Canada, we've achieved this decoupling of about 30%. Denmark has done one better at 40%. And the US has achieved also 40%. That is really good news. And as I said, we've reached peak oil. And in fact, there's just discussion, just this past summer, in fact, in August, the fact that trends indicate that we've passed peak oil, in part because of the COVID pandemic, which has caused a decrease in oil consumption, which has pushed the trend that was already there about extraction and use of peak oil. And here you can see in the graph that from 1980, and it's projected to go up to 2050. And this is how much energy is coming from different sources. You can see the oil is expected to peak right around now and go down, whereas other natural gas is expected to take over. And hopefully there will be increases in other sources, such as solar PV, and a little bit from geothermal, from hydroelectric. That is good news. Sorry, here's the bad news. Well, the bad news is, and I'm going to draw the analogy from what we know all too well right now, which is all about COVID-19. So here's the analogy. We need to flatten the curve. So let's go back to April, and you know what? Unfortunately, we're in the second wave now, and we're almost in the same situation. All right, so here we have a time course. This is for Ontario, and this was March 19th to the 30th of April. And here we have Ontario, the number of cases. We have current availability of ICU beds and known capacity. And then we have the number of confirmed cases in a best case scenario and the worst case scenario. So if you recall, and I'm sure you do, The argument has been we need to flatten the curve. In other words, the curve refers to the number of COVID-19 cases, the number of people that are infected. The more people who are infected, yet more people become infected, the transmission goes up. So there's a stock of people who are infected, and as that number grows, the rate of infection increases because it's you have a higher probability of running into somebody who's already infected and contracting the disease. So you've got to act swiftly to reduce the number of people that have COVID-19, to reduce the probability of somebody else getting it through community transfer. So I think we all understand that. It's all about flattening the curve. And the earlier you start, the less extreme the shutdown conditions are. The later you start, the more extreme the conditions are. And the reason, here we've got a capacity. The capacity issue is ICU beds. Now, let's take that into the climate discussion. It's unfortunately the same. Flattening the curve here means bringing down carbon dioxide emissions, because it's carbon dioxide emissions that are largely contributing to climate change. The earlier we start, the swifter and more effective the reduction in global warming. The later it goes, the more carbon dioxide that goes into the atmosphere, like over here on the COVID case, the less effective our measures are going to be. But the Earth, and here I'm going to draw an analogy with a bathtub. Oh, and I should mention here on this graph, we've got, again, year 1750 and 1750 to the year 2020. And here we have parts per million of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and you see it going up and up and up and up, which is a result of fossil fuel emissions that have gone up at an exponential rate. And even since we've been talking about climate change, they've been going up at an exponential rate. So what's this business about flattening the curve? So here we have a bathtub. We're filling it, and it's going to overflow if the plug is in, right? Or if the drain is blocked, then the bathtub could also overflow. And we don't want to overflow. So it's the same thing with carbon dioxide emissions and greenhouse gases. The tap has been on full. We've got CO2 in the atmosphere. We've got CO2 in the oceans, which provide an incredible inertia. The rate of reduction of carbon dioxide is very limited. That means we've got a lot of momentum in the system that's going to keep climate change happening. Well, that's pretty depressing. So I'm just going to get even more depressing now. So now I'm going to move to the discussion about energy specifically. We need innovation to decarbonize our economy. I hope I've convinced you of that. So now I'm just going to take you on a bit of a detour. So the detour is net useful energy. I want to introduce this concept. And here we have energy returned on energy invested, and it's just got this EROEI, that's the short form. So imagine you're back in Petrolia, Ontario, which is on the shores of Lake Erie, and you're back in 1910, and you sunk a well and the oil just came up. So you have tremendously high energy return on energy invested. You just sink your well and the oil comes up, and you can put it immediately into your boiler, your tractor, your factory, or whatever. And in fact, I talked about the Beverly Hillbillies, and I think I can talk about that with you because you're older. I've done this with my classes of undergrads, and they have no clue what the Beverly Hillbillies are, who found oil in the backwoods of I think it's California. Anyway, they lived in California, and they made a ton of money off of it because their EROEI was super high. Then you get into other alternatives such as biofuels, and you get it actually may be negative. You're putting in a lot of energy to get very little return. Okay, so why is this important? Why is this EROEI important? So imagine you have like this volume of energy, and some of it you have to reinvest just to get more energy going, like in Petrolia, right? Okay, I have to keep my pump going. Then you've got an amount that goes into essentials here: food, welfare, government. I got to keep my police force going, and then whatever's left over goes into discretionary consumption and investment to grow the society and keep it prosperous. So here's this energy hierarchy. First, we need energy. We have to extract the energy, we refine it, we transport it, and then we use the energy. We need food, we need to support our families, and if we have extra energy, we can put more money into education, healthcare, and finally the arts. But this pyramid leads to social stability, and that's the stability that we have right now, brought on by enough people having enough food on their plate, being an educated society where we can vote democratically, and we have healthcare. So the sad part is that as EROEI goes down, so does societal prosperity. So here we have high EROEI, in other, like the well in Petrolia, or well, we even have, to some extent, well, I won't go into fracking, but the easily obtained oil, like in the Middle East. As that goes down, as we get into the realm, I just have to rely on biofuels or on a bunch of wood. This is the Human Development Index. Across countries, you see it goes down. Less disposable energy, Human Development Index goes down, and the number of underweight children goes up as indicators of society prosperity, which for us will turn into stability. So here's the situation that we're finding ourselves in now. We have tapped the easiest high EROEI, high energy return sources of energy. We've pumped them out. In fact, it appears that the Middle East is, those high return reservoirs are being pumped down. Yes, there are new reservoirs, but you don't get as much energy out of them. You've got to put more of the energy you get out back into getting energy. You still have to provide food, welfare, government, and so on, but it means less discretionary consumption and investment, less for supporting the family, education, healthcare, and the arts, and more that goes into getting energy out. So the big question is, can society be supported by renewables? It is not clear that society can support this level of prosperity with renewables. So for example, we have EROEI here, along here, and it's actually high here. So hydroelectricity, the old oil and gas fields, coal, if you're right there, for example, in Alberta, and it's going right into a coal-fired power plant, which by the way, causes terrible pollution and health effects. Anyways, and here's the profit from the gross energy. As the EROEI goes down, it's not clear that you're getting enough energy out to be able to support society. Wind power is up here. I've seen more recent estimates which are not so optimistic, but nuclear does not offer the same EROEI. Photovoltaic cells are getting better, but it's not clear that you can make a windmill from windmill energy. Okay, that's so depressing. Let's please move on to solutions, because that's what we're here about. So we've looked at this before. We know that social stability is critical, not so much for us because we're older, but for our kids and our grandchildren. That's who we're talking about. We need to innovate to decarbonize the world's economy. So what are we going to do? We have to level the playing field. We have to drop subsidies to the fossil fuel industry that distorts production costs of energy. Right now, we pump a lot of money, a lot of public money to getting fossil fuels out of the ground. That's what this graph looks at. This is the percent of global GDP that is pumped back into getting energy on a pre-tax basis and a post-tax basis. This is for coal, petroleum products, natural gas, and electricity. Tremendous subsidies going in post-tax to getting coal and fossil fuels out of the ground. So this is an International Monetary Fund report that was just published. At the global level, energy subsidies are estimated at $4.7 trillion, or 6.3% of world GDP in 2017. And most of that has gone into coal and petroleum subsidies. If we got rid of them, if we had efficient fossil fuel pricing, because it's the inefficient fossil fuel pricing that causes these distortions and subsidies, if we had them in 2015, we would have lowered our global carbon emissions by almost a third, well, between a quarter and by over a quarter, and fossil fuel air pollution deaths by 46%, and increased government revenue by 3.8%. Get rid of the fossil fuel subsidies. So the good news is that we're sort of moving in that direction, but not nearly fast enough. The European Union seems to be the jurisdiction, or the regional jurisdiction, that has taken the most aggressive stance. Just this past summer, just this past year, the European Commission has passed a European Green Deal that has yet to be fully implemented, striving to be the first climate neutral continent with the goal of net zero carbon emissions by 2050. And that constitutes a decrease of 50 to 55% cut in emissions by 2030. The cost is going to be €1 trillion coming from different places, private and public sectors. The European Union has cut emissions by more than 20%, so they are on the way. This is not a panacea, but it's certainly moving in the right direction. Canada's action on climate change, it was announced last year, and it was reiterated in the throne speech that came from Parliament in September. It is not so ambitious. In fact, it has very few targets. Those targets are way off. The targets are 2030, 2050. They're long after the current government is in power. They're of very limited use. Canada's climate strategy has been slowed down by provinces, Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Ontario, who've taken the federal government to court to battle the implementation of a federal carbon tax. And by the way, that carbon tax is estimated to be too low to be of significant value, but it's of moral value, and it starts us down the road to increase the cost on carbon to make it effective. But what we're lacking is vision. We have raw materials, resources. We're an energy and resource-rich country. We should be using our fossil fuels to underwrite, to support our transition, to a low carbon economy. We need to underwrite that cost and transition, but it requires regulatory incentives, technological innovation, and a vision. Can you imagine an institute the size of one of our cancer institutes, for example, the Princess Margaret Hospital, but dedicated to renewable energy that will ultimately be the saving grace of the health for our kids and our grandchildren. Sorry, we don't have that investment. There are more private sector solutions, and the private sector is acting really out of self-interest to limit their financial liability. So the International Energy Agency has said oil companies avoid climate action at their own peril. And indeed, last January, Larry Fink of BlackRock, the very large investment fund, very influential, has said the evidence on climate risk is compelling investors to reassess core assumptions about modern finance. Well, they haven't divested from fossil fuels, but hopefully they will. And the latest writing on the wall is from BP, British Petroleum, or some say Past Petroleum, which recorded heavy losses. This was the CEO just this past August. And the commitment to move towards renewables. BP has just invested in wind farms in Europe. So we also hear the argument that it's going to cause tremendous dislocation, and it is. Today in Alberta, there is high unemployment and very stressful economic conditions. Yes, disruption is horrible, and that's hopefully why we have governments to lessen the cost of those transitions. But as Joseph Schumpeter says, we have the opportunity for creative destruction if we don't artificially subsidize those companies that are not economic, which are the fossil fuel companies. So I have here, for example, the very painful transition of all the tanneries as cars came online and the carriage makers. Just talked to a journalist today about the pain of being newspaper journalists in the day of social media. And the final example comes from slavery. Children worked in coal mines in the 1700s, early 1800s. The coal mining industry said that it could not afford to get children out of the mines. Children were brought out of coal mining because of moral reasons. They were unclothed, and the Christians thought that that was immoral. Today, we still have slavery, which fuels a lot of prosperity. But we're slaves to fossil fuels that are going to cause terrible and immoral pain to our kids and grandchildren. Now, I mentioned the connection between energy and prosperity, and there are some commentators that said to avoid collapse, we have to have an agenda for sustainable degrowth and relocalizing the economy. And already we've been doing that with COVID. This is Bill Rees, who's at University of Calgary. He's talked about a cooperative, orderly descent. Simply speaking, we cannot afford the affluence that we have today and have a life for our kids and grandchildren. He talks about fixing broken markets, rewriting the social contract, and rethinking globalization to restore the local, which, as I said, is happening. The final point I want to make is that it involves revisioning the future. And there are many commentators that they say that we have to re-envisage the future so that there's greater meaning. It's not shop to drop, it's finding meaning in what's important. For some, it's spirituality, for others, it's finding hope elsewhere. But it involves finding meaning in a simpler, less energy intensive life. And I truly believe that if we're going to make this disruptive transition, that it's up to us to envision what that new life looks like with greater meaning, a simpler life, a life with less throwaways and disposables, a life with greater meaning. And here I want to end by mentioning Thomas Homer Dixon's new book, Command Hope. We need opportunity, safety, justice, and fairness for all. My final point is that the older generations are the ones to take the lead. I don't know about you, but I grew up in the 1950s and the 1960s. Life was far less prosperous. We didn't have the same throwaway society. I know how to live like that. And that's what I need to go back to. And that's what the rest of us need to return to. A simpler, less energy intensive life. That's why we need to act on climate change. Thank you.
This is Miriam Diamond live now, and I'm really looking forward to entertaining your questions tonight. I'm really looking forward to having that discussion. I'm just terribly sorry we can't all be together. I'm going to start with the first question then. Why isn't solar energy a more acceptable option for energy? We run our cottage entirely on solar, and while our investment cost was high, it's already paying off. Well, that's a great suggestion. Solar energy is a terrific suggestion. It's clean, it's relatively clean, it's efficient, it can be rolled out relatively easily. It's just as I said about windmills, it's not clear that we can make solar voltaics from solar voltaic energy. But I should say that we're certainly increasing our efficiency with photovoltaics as the research continues. What I would like to see, though, is bringing the solar panels, solar voltaic industry back to Canada. Here's why we've lost the solar voltaic industry, and here's why I think it's really important for our prosperity. We need in Canada to be leaders in technology. Otherwise, we're going to be left behind in the dust as other countries move to transitioning their economies and finding more efficient energy sources. We did have a photovoltaic industry with the Ontario Green Energy Act that was tossed out when the current provincial government came in under Doug Ford. But there's another also troubling reason. It wasn't just political, but also photovoltaics are largely, the whole market now is wrapped up by China. China has secured, China is the only maker of the only miners and processors pretty well worldwide of rare earth elements that are required for photovoltaics and actually other green energy technologies. China has made sure that the cost of their photovoltaic cells are very low because of this vertical integration all the way from mining the rare earths to producing the photovoltaics, so that other countries have found it very difficult to compete on the market. What I would suggest is that, yes, let's go for photovoltaics. It is such a no-brainer. Let's make sure we can feed into the grid. Let's make sure you get offsets for the electricity that you produce from your photovoltaics. But let's also have that strategy to make photovoltaics here. Yes, it's going to require investment. That's the investment in our technological future. So I hope that's okay as an answer. I'm sorry I can't hear back from you. The next question is, are you concerned about other emissions? I understand that agriculture is adding to nitrous oxide emissions in significant amounts. Well, that's a great question. Let me start by saying that nitrous oxide is a very powerful greenhouse gas. I don't remember the exact equivalency between one molecule of nitrous oxide and one molecule of carbon dioxide, but one molecule of nitrous oxide is equivalent to many molecules of carbon dioxide in terms of the ability of that molecule to cause the greenhouse gas, the greenhouse effect. Yeah, I'm super worried about it. So there was recent research that came out showing surprisingly high emissions of nitrous oxide from agricultural production. There are a couple of solutions to this. Number one, optimize the rates of nitrogen application, ensuring that you don't put too much nitrogen into the soil. Nitrogen, of course, is put into the soil to increase crop production. So number one, optimize nitrogen input. Number two, there are agricultural practices like no-till farming that reduce the emissions of greenhouse gases like nitrous oxide back into the air. And I think that's those are some answers. And yeah, that's really important. Okay, the next question. How long will it take to discern that the uncoupling of fossil fuels in GDP is manifested as predicted in an amelioration of the effects on climate change and confirm cause and effect at the current rate of change? Well, the first thing I want to say is that I think it's very clear that there is a tight coupling between fossil fuel burning and GDP. The statistics have shown, so specifically emissions of carbon dioxide versus measures of GDP, as I mentioned in some graphs, have been going down in several countries. One thing I didn't mention that it was a really annoying, well, it's not annoying, but one complication to that decoupling of fossil fuel use with GDP is that countries that have achieved very high decoupling also import a lot of finished goods from the workhouses of notably China and Southeast Asia. So whereas many advanced Western countries have decoupled carbon and carbon consumption and GDP, some of that has been achieved by importing finished goods where the carbon is being emitted where the product is made in Southeast Asia. So we need fundamentally to reduce our consumption of products, anything that causes a consumption of fossil fuel energy. How long will it take? We're already on that road. The statistics are being compiled. It's happening. It's happening. The writing's on the wall, thank goodness, but it's not happening fast enough. The next question, climate change has been put aside to slow the pandemic, but will politicians continue to put aside climate change until the point of no return? Well, I have to tell you that I am very disappointed, concerned, and actually my emotions are a lot stronger than that. That I understand that our politicians are responding to the pandemic. It is an immediate concern. We have to respond. We are investing, though, over $250 billion back into the Canadian economy. Now is the time to use that reinvestment to change the economy. So yes, I am very disappointed and very concerned. The lessons are they're so parallel. I talked about flattening the curve with the pandemic. We also talked about investing in healthcare, in hospitals, and investing in a fast and responsive healthcare system. The threat is immediate with the pandemic. The threat is almost as immediate with climate change. It's just slower moving, and you don't see as many immediate casualties. And the casualties that occur, it's more challenging to say that's because of climate change. Well, I think you could do that with forest fires, though, and some flooding, and hurricanes and typhoons. Anyways, back to answering the questions. I'm concerned that our politicians will keep kicking the can down the road. And that's just happened with Canada's draft climate accountability legislation that has no benchmarks to keep Parliament in check to reducing our greenhouse gas emissions. There's nothing for 2025. And, you know, Minister Wilkinson, the federal minister of the environment, said, you know, when asked, what about accountability? And he said, well, you can vote us out. You know what? That's not good enough. No, that's just not good enough. If we want to ensure our health and our well-being, then we need Parliament to act now. Okay. If we didn't have fossil fuel subsidies, would we still need a carbon tax? I have to admit that I'm not sure about that. I think yes, but I think the answer is yes. What the fossil fuel subsidies do is they take away the even playing field and artificially make it artificially cheap to get fossil fuels to market. But we still need a carbon tax because we've got to get the most polluting sources of greenhouse gases out of production, off the market. We have to get rid of them. For example, coal-fired power plants that are due to be phased out. Of course, Ontario has phased out all coal-fired power plants. There's still coal-fired power plants in other parts of the country, notably Alberta, Saskatchewan, that doesn't have a lot of hydroelectric. So yes, we still need a carbon tax, which is really, and the price on carbon has to be increased to really get movement looking for market solutions, but market solutions are not sufficient. We need market solutions and regulatory solutions. Should we be moving away from factory farming or even plant-based diets, avoiding cars, switching to electric, reducing energy use? Oh, okay. So hopefully those are some different options. So yes, we should. I'm not going to comment about the factory farming first, but the first thing to do is, yeah, switch your diet, because eating lower on the food chain really reduces greenhouse gas emissions. And why is that? Because so much agricultural produce has to go into creating both meat and any animal products. So it's an incredibly inefficient use of crops, like pulses, lentils, beans, and so on. We need to be eating way lower on the food chain, which is better for our health and better for climate change. There was a terrific article from out from the Lancet, I think it was last year, talking about a green and healthy diet. This is the quintessential co-benefit. The co-benefit is that you improve your own health by having less meat in your diet and animal-based products, and you improve the health of the globe, of the earth. Great solution. Should we be avoiding cars? Yeah. And I have to say that's very tricky during a pandemic. And what it shows is how we've built our society on this fossil fuel-based system. Yes, we have to be moving away from cars. Are electric vehicles the answer? No. No, they're not the answer. What electric vehicles do is shift where the power comes from. The power is still necessary to keep the car going. So let me just explain a little bit. If we have a dirty source of electricity, then we're going to have such and emits greenhouse gases. The electric vehicle will still be producing greenhouse gases. In Ontario, where we have more of a mix of hydroelectric, and we have the opportunity to have a cleaner energy mix, then our emissions go down. But that's not the only story. We can't afford to have fleets of electric vehicles. As I was just reading in the paper on the weekend, one power station costs about $38,000 to install. Where do I want $38,000 to go? I want it to go into finding energy solutions that will benefit everybody. The bottom line is public transit. There's no question. Public transit is most efficient, not electric vehicles. which are an improvement over internal combustion vehicles, but the electric vehicles are not the answer. I'm intrigued by and supportive of your point that we need to move to a simpler life. Many who argue for carbon taxes and carbon capture often seem to imply that our consumption does not need to change if we have these measures. Oh, I'm very happy you asked that question. There are many commentators, there are many people that just say, let's do this switch. Yeah, let's just implement carbon capture and, we're going to be fine. Well, unfortunately, we have to be honest. And the honest answer is no, we're not going to be fine. We cannot support this level of consumption. We can't support it because of the energy that's consumed and the resources that are consumed. It's very sobering, but it's very honest to say we have no choice but to reduce our consumption. We are over-consuming. There have been several very definitive analyses on this. More than anything, our affluence is contributing to our downfall right now. Our current affluence cannot be sustained over several generations. It is a key issue. We have to confront the reality that our current rates of consumption are not sustainable. We cannot have our cake and eat it too. The next question is, Ontario's energy mix in 2020 includes 55% electricity generated from nuclear. Is it sustainable? Oh, that is really an interesting and challenging question. We've invested a huge amount of energy into our nuclear plants. In other words, the EROEI, it hasn't even been calculated because it's so difficult to calculate, or at least I haven't seen those calculations. The amount of energy invested to get nuclear energy back out is enormous. We continue to grapple with the problems of what we're going to do with radioactive waste, where we're going to put it. We have not fundamentally solved these problems. It's costing a huge amount of money to retool our aging nuclear reactors in Ontario. I would like to see more sober analysis done on this. Do you have opinions on the current effectiveness of washers and dryers and the filtering of microplastics as well as energy use? Okay. Well, first of all, putting a filter on your washing machine reduces the emission of microplastics. Yes. Putting a secondary dryer filter on reduces the release of microplastics. But what about energy use? I'm not sure if the implication is that putting filters on these machines actually increases energy use. And I think the answer is no. Older machines had lint traps and reduced emissions of microplastics and microfibers. So, and are there any other questions? There are some more questions. Okay, let the questions roll. Oh, okay. Any thoughts on the role of engineering to limit the impact of fossil fuel use on the climate, such as geoengineering? In chemical engineering, CO2 recapture and repurposing is a very hot topic. Are environmental scientists interested in collaborating with experts in these new technologies? So the answer is that yes, climate scientists of all different stripes and engineers have been involved in these analyses. And right now, as far as I understand, the analysis shows that carbon capture is not going to be ultimately effective. It requires too much energy to effect carbon capture. In other words, this ratio of energy return on energy invested is not sufficiently positive to allow for efficient carbon capture. It requires energy to get the fossil fuels out of the ground and to put the carbon back into the ground. So I have to say I'm part engineer as well, and I have been following these conversations. So there's a lot of collaboration going on. Carbon capture is one way of keeping the fossil fuel industry going, but ultimately I am not optimistic that that's going to work. Rather, I think we should move forward with it, but we also have to move forward with using those fossil fuels to produce renewable energy sources. What do you think of small modular nuclear units as part of a climate solution? Recently, David Suzuki was quoted, he said, "Small nuclear units, that's enough to make me puke." There are proponents of small nuclear units, and this seems to be garnering attention. I'm not convinced that the energy return on energy invested is going to be sufficiently positive. There are so many problems of bedevil nuclear energy, as I mentioned, such as dealing with the attendant problems of getting uranium, upgrading the uranium, dealing with radioactive waste, and the energy that it takes to deal with radioactive waste. Think of that. It's taking away from that net energy being produced by the nuclear reactor. We have to think of it more comprehensively. So I'm not convinced that small nuclear reactors are, at least in their present iteration, a good climate solution. Oh yeah, so do you see the role of deep geothermal? I'm from BC and stunned, nothing is occurring. Also, what about shallow geothermal, like heat pumps? Why aren't they in every home? Well, if you live in an area that would support geothermal, go for it. But what you have to have is enough of an aquifer to be able to pump the water out. So if you live in an area that's underlain by clay, and University of Toronto happens to be located on a clay bed, then geothermal isn't a particularly, it's not going to work. So there's certain areas in which geothermal is optimal, and obviously Iceland is the prime example where geothermal will work, but there are many locations where it will work. What a great idea to use geothermal. It provides heating in the winter and cooling in the summer. So geothermal is great, and heat pumps are very important for heat exchange. So heat pumps, yes, we should be mandating heat pumps in all new builds, and we should be putting in heat pumps in retrofitting buildings, because both building and transportation are the largest sources of greenhouse gas emissions. Yes, heat pumps. We need to go there. What are some tangible things that alumni could get involved in to help climate change? Are there organizations or projects that you recommend that people should support? I'm not going to recommend specific organizations, but what I do recommend is that each one of us be involved. This is far too dire a situation for us not to be involved. We cannot afford not to be involved. We cannot afford to be bystanders. What does that mean? It means that today, pardon me, I could be making decisions on what I eat, how many different clothes I buy, what my consumption is. I could start reducing my consumption today. Tomorrow, I can think about changing my mode of transportation. You know that, like, Canada has a large fleet of pickup trucks, SUVs. Those are gas guzzlers. What are we doing with large vehicles as we face down climate change? So change your vehicle out. Invest in reducing energy consumption in your residence. So those are immediate things that we can do. But I want to also be really clear that it's not just an individual problem. It's a problem that we have to tackle together. Right now, the federal government is doing, unfortunately, not having sufficient vision is kind of weak-kneed. But many of our municipalities are moving forward in more aggressive and effective ways. Think of Vancouver, think of Toronto, Montreal, Halifax, lots of municipalities who feel the brunt of climate change in terms of flooding, in terms of heat waves. the municipalities are acting. We can support our cities. We can all join groups. And frankly, I'm just going to get a little bit more militant. With that, I would like to thank you very much for being involved tonight. I hope I've convinced you of why climate change is important and why we all need to act on it. So thank you very much.
Thank you all for listening today, and I hope you'll tune in for our other U of T Where You Are lectures. In the meantime, please check out the wide range of other programs on the Alumni Hub and let us know what you thought of this presentation and from where you were tuning in. In closing, best wishes from all of us at the University of Toronto. Please do keep well, and we look forward to seeing you soon.